Alright, in this video I will be building an entryway or mudroom closet. As you can see, the shelf and bar are already gone. I have painted the walls, removed the doors, and also painted the ceiling. The ceiling is flat white and the walls are a color called bunny gray, which is a Benjamin Moore color. I will not be doing the floor or the trim, as I will be doing that in another job. So the first thing I'm going to do is make the shelf, and I'm measuring the width of the closet here at approximately 58 inches. I think I'm cutting everything about 58 and a quarter. So for this I've got some 3-inch and 4-inch maple boards, and I'm going to use these to make the supports for the shelf. So the first one you can see there, cut at 58 inches. This is going to make up one of the 3 main supports for the shelf itself, which is going to be made out of maple plywood. So for the maple plywood, this stuff is a little bit more expensive at about $80 Canadian for a 4-foot by 8-foot sheet. And this one had a little bit of a blemish in it, so I'm just going to cut that out first. Using a circular saw and this chipboard jig that I made to just do some straight clean cuts. The circular saw and chipboard jig will allow me to cut a nice straight line and get rid of that blemished piece of plywood. This is also 3/4 inch maple. Now I'm going to use the jig again, and I'm going to cut the shelf at 58 inches. And just as a note, I did get Lowe's to do the first rip cut in the store at 15 inches. So my shelf is going to be 15 inches wide. And the next step is to measure the side support brackets for the shelf, and those are about 14 and a quarter, and I'm going to need 2 of those, one for each side of the shelf, obviously. And again, I am using the 3-inch solid maple boards to make those. So that's what the shelf is going to look like upside down once it's in the closet. Now I'm going to use this Makita random orbital sander, some 120 grit sandpaper, and then some 220 grit sandpaper to sand the boards down before I mount them on the wall. Not too much of a secret here. Like I said, I'm going to use the 120 grit. I'm going to clean the boards up so that there's no pieces of the 120 grit left around, as well as get all the grit off the piece of cardboard that I'm using. And then I'm going to switch over to the 220 grit sandpaper. I'm definitely a fan of using the random orbital sander rather than doing it all by hand. As well, one thing you want to note when you're doing this is to try and go as much as possible in the same direction as the grain. You don't want to do heavy cross grain sanding. And I also get the edges, because once the shelf is on, you will see the bottom edge of the board. Not the top edge so much, but definitely the bottom will stand out if it looks bad. And if you do both, then you can pick which side you think is nicer and go with that when you mount it up. And like I said, once I've done it with the 120 grit, I'm going to switch over to the 220 grit for the final sanding on these prior to installation on the wall. Now I'm trying to do a pretty good job, but I am going to have to sand them one more time because I'm going to use the nail gun to attach them to the wall, and I'm going to have to obviously use some wood filler. I also did a bit of a test run on the different types of stain that I had. First one is special walnut. The second one is dark walnut. And those are both Minwax colors. And the third one I have here is a Varathane color, and it is espresso. So I got 3 different colors of increasing darkness. Now this final color is actually a polyurethane and stain in one, so it goes on a lot thicker and covers up the grain of the wood. So it's not what I was looking for. If I had a cheaper wood and I wanted to sort of cover up the wood itself but still get some of that grain coming through, I'd probably use the poly shade. But because I want to see the actual grain of the maple, I'm going to use one of these lighter stains. And I do end up going with this special walnut. So I put a couple marks on the back of the shelf before I attach the board. Basically that 66 inches is going to be the height that I want my bar sitting in the closet. So I'm going to push the shelf up to approximately 71 inches. Once I've got the rear support at 71 inches, take the level, make sure that the board's nice and level. I'm just going to mark along the top prior to using the stud finder and doing some exploratory drilling just to make sure that the wood studs are where the stud finder says they should be. Now this cheap Black & Decker stud finder I've got was okay. I would say it gets you in the ballpark of where a stud should be. I didn't find it was incredibly accurate. Now before I start nailing through my good board, I did do a few test nails just so I had the air pressure at the right setting. And I'm using these pass load 2-inch nails, and I'm also going to use some of this PL construction adhesive for the back of the boards. Basically, you can see it there, good smear of the PL construction adhesive. I'm going to put that on the wall, and then I'm going to pop some of the nails through the board and into the studs behind. Obviously you want to wear safety glasses, and if you can't find safety glasses, you can always wear your wife's sunglasses. So I banged one nail in, got the level out, made sure it was nice and level, and then popped a second nail in. And then the board is pretty much set in place, and you can just put all the nails in where these studs are. In total, I've got 12 nails in this board. Once I've got that set, I'm going to use some of this wood filler and just fill all the nail holes. You can either use a putty knife, but I usually just use my finger to make sure the putty's in the hole and relatively flat prior to waiting a little bit to let it dry. And I'm going to do that to every hole. Once the putty's dry, I'm just going to come straight back over with the 220 grit sandpaper and give the whole board a buff down with a little bit of extra focus on where I did the hole filling with the putty. Now that I've got the rear support in place, I'm just doing the two side supports, and for these I didn't get as many nails as I'd like to, but I did find 2 studs to nail into, so they get 4 nails each. And same deal with them, use the wood filler, let it dry, and then come back with the 220 grit sandpaper and sand them down. Now before I do any of the staining, I'm using this Minwax pre-stain, and that's just to help get a more consistent coat of stain on your board so that it actually looks a little bit more cohesive and you don't get really patchy spots. For this stuff, I just use these foam brushes, and basically you're just painting it on, getting it slightly damp, sort of consistently across the board, and then you're going to wait about 15 minutes, give or take, prior to staining the board. Now the stain goes on very similar to the pre-stain treatment. Basically I use the foam brush again. You have other options. You could just use a rag, dip it in, and rub it on the board. I find your hand gets a little bit nasty if you do that, or you need to go through a lot of gloves. So I don't mind using these foam brushes and basically painting the stain onto the board. And the process I just showed there is what I'm going to do for the other 2 boards that I've attached to the wall. Now I'm going to let the stain dry for about 15 minutes, and I'm going to take one of these towels and I'm going to wipe off all the excess stain. If you don't do this step, you're going to find that your board has an inconsistent stain on it, and it's not going to look as good. So definitely you want to let the stain set in for a little while and then wipe off all the excess stain on the board. Now I'm going to let this sit overnight prior to putting a second coat of stain on in the exact same manner. With 2 coats of stain on, I'm now going to use polyurethane as my finishing coat. Now you don't want to shake the polyurethane, they recommend stirring it. And I'm going to use the same type of foam brush, obviously a new one each time, to apply the polyurethane. And it goes on just like everything else, a nice thin coat. Make sure it's not dripping. And then for this it recommends at least 3 hours of dry time. I gave it closer to 5 hours of dry time prior to sanding it. Now I'm just going to show the one side board, but I do the exact same process to the other 2 boards as well. Now prior to sanding the polyurethane, I'm just going to do some test fitting with some of the wood that I've already got. Basically I don't want to do the test fit while I still have to do a second coat of polyurethane. Now you can see it's actually a really tight fit. Sometimes in the rear corner of the drywall it's not perfectly square. I got lucky this time and the actual drywall is really square at the rear of the closet. I didn't videotape me cutting this one, but this one is approximately 56 inches, and that's going to fit right underneath the shelf and support it at the front. And the final board I got is actually a 4-inch piece of maple, and this one's the full 58 inches. And it's going to be used to hide the fact that the shelf is actually made out of plywood. And it's also going to provide additional strength so that the shelf doesn't start bending in the center. You do have other options to hide that plywood front edge if that's what you want to do. You can get a veneer, but I kind of like the look of the full board. Now, I'm not going to show the sanding of the solid maple boards, but I will show the plywood for a second. It's done in a very similar manner. Again, I'm going to use the 120 grit sandpaper and transition to the 220 grit sandpaper on both sides as well as on the edges. And I'm going to focus on, again, going in the direction of the grain. I think it's also prudent that I good mouth this Makita sander. It's been one of the best purchases I've made. I would say that it's lasted 10 years and I got it on sale for like 30 bucks. So now that I'm in my basement dungeon here, I'm going to do the pre-stain treatment on both the boards, which are already done, as well as the plywood. Basically, this is a bit of a slow process now because you have to do one side, let it dry, stain it, then do the other side, let it dry, and then do the second coat of stain. So it definitely takes a while. The actual work only takes a few minutes, it's just the dry time is extremely long. And just like the stain, when you're doing the pre-stain treatment, you want a nice even coat. You don't want big wet patches on your board or anything like that. So nice thin even coat. Now that the pre-treatment's evaporated and or dried into the wood, it's time to hit it with the stain. Again, using the same color, the same foam applicator. I'm just going to paint it on in a nice even coat. Let it sit for 10 to 15 minutes. And then I'm going to come back in with a clean cloth and wipe off all the excess stain. What I found was the plywood actually gets a much more consistent color across the entire piece of the wood as compared to the actual solid maple boards. However, we were going for a distressed look, so having the solid maple a bit uneven is actually what we wanted. So again, I'm going to use the exact same clean cotton cloths and just wipe it down. And you can see that while you're wiping it, the actual darkness of the stain really reduces. And really the objective here is to get all the excessive wet stain off the top of the wood and make sure that everything's nice and even. If you're doing sheets of plywood, there's a very good chance that you're going to need more than one or two rags just because there's so much surface area and they do become quite saturated with this stain. So have a couple extra rags on hand. So after getting a second rag, this is what it looks like. Again, if you're using a really dark stain, you're definitely going to want to use gloves. Really, if you use any stain, you should wear gloves, but I found that stains like that espresso will really stain up your hands pretty bad. And that's what the boards look like after one coat of stain. Now for the polyurethane, you could just do a second coat, but that's generally not the preferred method. It is best to take the 220 grit sandpaper and then hit it again with the polyurethane, and you'll end up getting a flatter, more even coat of polyurethane. Doing the second coat really makes it look a lot better. If you do a third coat, which is what I actually end up doing, it even looks better. So when it comes to the polyurethane, I find the more coats you do, the better it's going to look. As far as the application of the polyurethane for the second coat and third coat, it is exactly the same. Just use the foam applicator and paint the polyurethane straight onto the boards. After waiting 3 or 4 hours, I'm now going to take 320 grit sandpaper and give the supporting boards a quick buff down with the 320 grit, and I'm going to hit them again with the polyurethane, and it's going to come out with a nice, smooth, even polyurethane coat. Now, if you've never sanded polyurethane before, it does look like you've just ruined your board. You're going to get white, dusty polyurethane residue all over the place, but that's to be expected. Basically, you're sanding it down, and the new polyurethane will fill in all the cracks and gaps, but you do want to make sure that you wipe off all this polyurethane dust before you apply your additional coats of polyurethane. And again, no change here. On the third coat, just use the foam applicator, paint on your polyurethane. Now I did do 2 coats of stain on each side of the plywood as well as the 4 and 3 inch solid maple boards that I got here, but I didn't show that just because there's really no change. Now for doing the polyurethane on the plywood, very similar. It is definitely easier to do flat on the ground like this as opposed to on the wall, and a lot less messy. Again, I'm using the foam applicator and just painting the polyurethane straight onto the plywood. Once the polyurethane's dried for about 4 hours, again, I'm going to take the 220 grit sandpaper, sand it down, do a second coat of polyurethane on it, then take the 320 grit sandpaper, sand it down one more time, and do a third coat of polyurethane. Now you can use a random orbital sander to do this. I just find that it gets a little aggressive. It has a tendency to go right through the polyurethane and start digging up some of the stain, which is very noticeable. So generally I do the polyurethane sanding by hand just to avoid damaging the wood and stain underneath. And just like the sanding of the wood, you want to go in the same direction as the grain as much as possible. Once it's got a good sanding with the 220 grit, wipe down the board and redo the polyurethane coat. By doing multiple coats, it definitely adds a bit of depth to the wood and makes it look a little more interesting. And finally, I'm going to use the 320 grit on the plywood. Again, sanding by hand, getting all the little bumps off, and just trying to generally smooth it out now. And the final step will be adding the final coat of polyurethane. For all the wood in the basement, I gave it pretty much the same dry time, which was 3 to 4 hours between sanding. The one thing to note is I did do both sides of all of the wood, which really added a lot of extra time, because essentially that's 2 coats of stain, 3 coats of polyurethane, each side with a dry time of 3 hours. So it really takes days to get it all done, but the actual application only takes a few minutes. Now for this bar, we wanted a black bar, but I couldn't find that. They just had these high gloss bars. So what I did was sand the bar with some 220 grit sandpaper for a while, and now I'm going to hit it with this etching primer, and then I'm going to paint it with some black spray paint. So not much to see here. I'm just using some nails to support it on paint cans so that I could rotate the bar around as I'm painting it. And so far the paint that I did on here is holding up with clothes on it, so seems to have worked. Okay, once the shelf is dry, you can see that I've got it in place. I've also painted these brackets black to go with the bar, and I'm going to in place 2 brackets on the back of the closet and 2 brackets on the side, and this is really just to hold the top of the shelf down to the support brackets, and you can see, just like I said, 2 in the back, 1 on the side. Now it's time to place the front support board under the shelf, and I'm going to use a bit of Gorilla Glue as well for this. So some glue, some clamps, and now I'm going to use some more brackets and hold this into place from the rear side, so inside of the shelf so you can't see it. So I put 2 in the corners and then 4 on the inside. So I definitely used a lot more brackets on this front board, but that's because it doesn't have a whole bunch of stuff to hold it. So I don't want the shelf to start flexing down, and that's why I want it nice and secure in the front. And just for interest's sake, the paint that I'm using is Benjamin Moore Regal Select. Now really the last thing I need to do for the shelf is to mount the 4-inch board, which is going to cover up that 3-inch board, as well as cover up the plywood so that you can't tell that I use plywood. So everything's going to look like solid wood here. And it's going to mount on like that. Again, I'm going to use Gorilla Glue clamps, and I'm not going to use brackets. I'm going to screw right through the board in the back with 1 1/4 inch screws. I found it was more simplistic to start on one end and start screwing towards the other side and basically just move the bar clamp down as I went. So you can see for this I just punched the screws right through there, and I'm going to put about 8 to 10 screws in, and that's going to give a good strong bond for the 4-inch board onto the 3-inch board, and it's going to help with support for the shelf. So there's the shelf fully attached, and looking from the back side, I do have some glue to clean up, but that's okay. You can see I got the screws in the back side, but they don't poke through the front, so it's good and concealed. So ideally this shelf will never flex down, and I've done shelves with this layout before and I've never once had a problem with the front side flexing down. It's going to stay nice and flat. And you can see it's got that front distressed look. Now a bit of a side note here, because the closet's a little bit dark, I've got these LED automatic sensing lights that I'm going to put inside the closet. And you can see that's what they look like when they're on. And these just stick on with little Velcro stickers, so if you want to move them in the future you can. And they're supposed to last for 6 years, but we'll see. So you can see I went on the sides of the closet so that the light is cast onto the clothes as well as up. I found if I put them on the top of the closet, only the shelf would get light and you would not get additional light on your clothes. However, I could change my mind. It's just Velcro and a sticker holding those lights on. So one point of interest, in addition to the black spray paint, I used this Rust-Oleum 2X clear coat for the closet bar. And there's the whole thing finished with the wood shelf, the black bar, and the LED side lights. So there you can see the wood that I was trying to replicate with this maple, and I think I did a pretty solid job with selecting a good piece of wood that would actually mimic the wood on that bench that we've already got. Just for interest's sake, that bar is 11 inches from the back wall, and it is about 65 inches off the floor. And you can see it is level. Overall, this took a long time to do just because of all the dry time, and overall I think it turned out pretty good. Now all I gotta do is put the doors back on the closet. Anyway, thanks for checking out my video, and don't forget to like and subscribe.